here we are, Saturday, November 26th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and we are reading To a God Unknown by John Steinbeck. Chapter 21. The cold of late autumn came into the valley, and the high, brindled clouds hung in the air for days at a time. Elizabeth felt the golden sadness of the approaching winter, but there was something missing, the excitement of the storms. She went often to the porch to look at the oak tree. The leaves were all pale tan by now, waiting only the buffering of rain to fall to the ground. Joseph did not look at the tree any more. When its life was gone, no remnant of his feeling for it remained. He walked often in the brittle grass of the side hills. He went bareheaded, wearing jeans and a shirt and a black vest. Often he looked up at the gray clouds and sniffed in the air and found nothing in the air to reassure him. "There's no rain in these clouds," he told Thomas. "This is a high fog from the ocean." Thomas had caught 2 baby hawks in the spring, and he was making hoods for them and preparing to fly them against the wild ducks that whistled down the sky. "It isn't time, Joseph," he said. "Last year the rains came early, I know, but I've heard it isn't unusual in this country to get much rain before Christmas." Joseph stooped and picked up a handful of ash-dry dust and let it trickle through his fingers. "It'll take a lot of rain to do any good," he complained. "The summer drank the water out deep down. Have you noticed how low the water is in the well? Even the potholes in the river are dry now." "I've smelled the dead eels," Thomas said. "Look, this little leather cap goes on the hawk's head to keep him blind until I'm ready to start him. It's better than shooting ducks." The hawk gashed at his thick gloves while he fitted the leather hood on its head. When November came and went without rain, Joseph grew quiet with worry. He rode to the springs and found them dried up, and he drove his post-hole digger deep into the ground without finding damp soil. The hills were turning gray as the covering of grass wore off, and the white flint stuck out and caught the light. When December was half gone, the clouds broke and scattered. The sun grew warm, and an apparition of summer came into the valley. Elizabeth saw now how the worry was making Joseph thin, how his eyes were strained, almost white. She tried to find tasks to keep him busy. She needed new cupboard space, new clotheslines. It was time a high chair was made ready for the baby. Joseph went about the tasks and finished them before Elizabeth could think of new ones. She sent him to town for supplies, and he returned on a wet and panting horse. "Why do you rush back?" she demanded. "I don't know. I'm afraid to go away. Something might happen." Slowly in his mind there was a rising of fear that the dry years had come. The dusty air and the high barometer did not reassure him. Head colds broke out among the people on the ranch. The children sniffled all day long. Elizabeth developed a hard cough, and even Thomas, who was never sick, wore cold compresses made of black stocking on his throat at night. But Joseph grew leaner and harder. The muscles of his neck and jaw stood out under a thin covering of brown skin. His hands grew restless, went to playing with pieces of stick or with a pocket knife, or worked intermittently at his beard, smoothing it down and turning the ends under. He looked about at his land, and it seemed to be dying. The pale hills and fields, the dust-gray sage, the naked stones frightened him. On the hills only the black pine grove did not change. It brooded darkly, as always, on the ridge-top. Elizabeth was very busy in the house. Alice had gone home to Nuestra Senora to take up her rightful position as a sad woman whose husband would return some day. She carried the affair with dignity, and her mother received compliments on Alice's fine restraint and decent mourning. Alice began every day as though Juanito would return by evening. The loss of her helper made more work for Elizabeth. Caring for her child, washing and cooking filled her days. She remembered the time before her marriage only hazily, and with a good deal of contempt. In the evenings, when she sat with Joseph, she tried to reestablish the fine contact she had made before the baby was born. She liked to tell him things that had happened when she was a little girl in Monterey, although the things didn't seem real to her anymore. While Joseph stared moodily at the spots of fire that showed through the little windows of the stove, she talked to him. "I had a dog," she said. "His name was Camille. I used to think that was the loveliest name in the world. I knew a little girl who was named Camille, and the name fitted her. She had skin with the softness of camellias. So I named my dog after her, and she was very angry." Elizabeth told how Tarpey shot a squatter and was hanged on the limb of a tree on the fish flats, and she told of the lean, stern woman who kept the lighthouse at Point Joe. Joseph liked to hear her soft voice, and he didn't usually listen to her words, but he took her hand and explored it all over with his fingertips. Sometimes she tried to argue him out of his fear. Don't worry about the rain. It will come. Even if there isn't much water this year, there will be in another year. I know this country, dear. But it would take so much rain. There won't be time if it doesn't start pretty soon. The rain will get behind in the year. One evening she said, I think I'd like to ride again. Rama says it won't hurt me now. Will you ride with me, dear? Of course, he said. Begin in a little time, then it won't hurt you. I'd like to have you ride up to the pines with me. The smell of the pines would be good. He looked slowly over at her. I've thought of going there, too. There's a spring in the grove, and I want to see if it's dried up like all the rest. His eyes grew more animated as he thought of the circle in the pines. The rock had been so green when he saw it last. That must be a deep spring. I don't know how it could dry up, he said. Oh, I have more reasons than that for wanting to go, she said, laughing. I think I told you something about it. When I was carrying the baby, I deceived Thomas one day and drove up to the pines, and I went into the central place where the big rock is and where the spring is. She frowned, trying to remember the thing exactly. Of course, she said, my condition was responsible for what happened. I was oversensitive. She glanced up to find Joseph eagerly looking at her. Yes, he said, tell me. Well, as I say, it was my condition. When I was carrying the child, little things grew huge. I didn't find the path going in. I broke my way through the underbrush, and then I came into the circle. It was quiet, Joseph, more quiet than anything I've ever known. I sat in front of the rock because that place seemed saturated with peace. It seemed to be giving me something I needed. In speaking of it, the feeling came back to her. She brushed her hair over her ears, and the wide-set eyes looked far off. And I loved the rock. It's hard to describe. I loved the rock more than you or the baby or myself, and this is harder to say. While I sat there, I went into the rock. The little stream was flowing out of me, and I was the rock, and the rock was, I don't know, the rock was the strongest, dearest thing in the world. She looked nervously about the room. Her fingers picked at her skirt. The thing she had intended to tell as a joke was forcing itself back upon her. Joseph took up her nervous hand and held the fingers still. Tell me, he insisted gently. Well, I must have stayed there quite a while because the sun moved, but it seemed only a moment to me, and then the feeling of the place changed. Something evil came into it. Her voice grew husky with the memory. Something malicious was in the glade, something that wanted to destroy me. I ran away. I thought it was after me, the great crouched rock, and when I got outside I prayed. Oh, I prayed a long time. Joseph's light eyes were piercing. Why do you want to go back there? He demanded. Why, don't you see? She replied eagerly. The whole thing was my condition, but I've dreamed about it several times, and it comes often to my mind. Now that I'm all well again, I want to go back and see that it's just an old moss-covered rock in a clearing. Then I won't dream about it anymore. Then it won't threaten me anymore. I want to touch it. I want to insult it because it frightened me. She released her fingers from Joseph's grip and rubbed them to ease the pain in them. You've hurt my hand, dear. Are you afraid of the place, too? No, he said. I'm not afraid. I'll take you up there. He fell silent, wondering whether he should tell her what Juanito had said about the pregnant Indian women who went to sit in front of the rock, and about the old ones who lived in the forest. It might frighten her, he thought. It is better that she should lose her fear of the place. He opened the stove and threw in an armful of wood and turned the damper straight to set the flame roaring. When would you like to go? He asked. Why, any time. If the day is warm tomorrow, I'll pack a lunch into a saddlebag. Rama will take care of the baby. We'll have a picnic, she spoke eagerly. We haven't had a picnic since I've been here. I don't know anything I love more. At home, she said, we took our lunches to Huckleberry Hill, and after we'd eaten, Mother and I picked buckets of berries. Well, we'll go there tomorrow, he agreed. I'm going to look in at the barn now, dear. As she watched him leave the room, she knew that he was concealing something from her. Probably it's only his worry about the rain, she thought. And from habit, she turned her eyes to the barometer and saw that the needle was high. Joseph stepped down from the porch. He moved close to the oak tree before he realized that it was dead. If only it were alive, he thought, I would know what to do. I have no counsel anymore. He walked on into the barn, expecting to find Thomas there, but the barn was dark, and the horses snorted at him as he walked behind them. There's plenty of hay in the stalk this year, he thought. The knowledge comforted him. The sky was misty clear when he went back across the yard. He thought he could see a pale ring around the moon, but it was so faint that he could not be sure. Before sunup the next morning, Joseph went to the barn, curried 2 horses, and brushed them, and, as a last elegance, painted their hoofs black and rubbed their coats with oil. Thomas came in while he was at work. "You're making a considerable fuss," he said. "Going to town?" Joseph rubbed the oil in until the skins shone like dull metal. "I'm taking Elizabeth to ride," he announced. "She hasn't been on a horse for a long time." Thomas rubbed his hand down one of the shiny rumps. "I wish I could go with you, but I've work to do. I'm taking the men down to the river bed to dig a hole. We may have trouble finding water for the cattle pretty soon." Joseph stopped his work and looked worriedly at Thomas. "I know it, but there must be water under the river bed. You should strike it a few feet down." "It'll rain pretty soon, Joseph. I hope it will. I'm getting sick of the dusty throat." The sun came up behind a high, thin film of cloud that sucked the warmth and paled the light. Over the hills there came a cold, steady wind that blew the dust to ripples and made little drifts of yellow fallen leaves. It was a lonely wind, scudding along the ground, flowing evenly with very little sound. After breakfast, Joseph let out the saddled horses, and Elizabeth, in her divided skirt and high-heeled boots, came out of the house carrying a bag of lunch. "Take a warm coat," Joseph warned her. She lifted her face to the sky. "It's winter at last, isn't it, Joseph? The sun has lost its heat." He helped her on her horse, and she laughed because of the good feeling of the saddle, and she patted the flat horn top affectionately. "It's good to be able to ride again," she said. "Where shall we go first?" Joseph pointed to a little peak on the eastern ridge above the pines. "If we go to the top, we can look down through the pass of Puerto Suelo and see the ocean," he said. "And we can see the top of the redwoods." "It's good to feel the horse moving," she repeated. "I've been missing it. I didn't know." The flashing hooves kicked up a fine white dust which stayed in the air after they had passed and made a path behind them like the smoke of a train. They rode up the gentle slope through the thin, spare grass, and at the water cuts they went down and up again with a quick jerk. "Remember how the cuts raced with water last year?" she reminded him. Pretty soon it'll be that way again." Far off on a hillside they saw a dead cow, almost covered by slow, gluttonous buzzards. I hope we don't get to windward of that, Joseph." He looked away from the feast. "They don't give meat a chance to spoil," he said. "I've seen them standing in a circle around a dying animal, waiting for the moment of death. They know that moment." The hill grew steeper, and they entered the cracking sage, dark and dry and leafless now. The twigs were so brittle that they seemed dead. In an hour they came to the peak, and from there, sure enough, they saw the triangle of ocean through the pass. The ocean was not blue, it was steel gray, and on the horizon the dark fog banks rose in heavy ramparts. "Tie up the horses, Joseph," she said. "Let's sit a while. I haven't seen the ocean for so long. Sometimes I wake up in the night and listen for the waves and for the foghorn of the lighthouse and the bellbuoy off China Point, and sometimes I can hear them, Joseph. They must be very deeply fixed in me. Sometimes I can hear them. In the mornings early when the air was still, I remember how I could hear the fishing boats pounding out and the voices of the men calling back and forth from boat to boat." He turned away from her. I haven't that to miss," he said. These things of hers seemed like a little heresy to him. She sighed deeply. "When I hear those things in my head, I get homesick, Joseph. This valley traps me, and I have the feeling that I can never escape from it and that I'll never really hear the waves again, nor the bellbuoy, nor the gulls sliding in the wind." "You can go back to visit any time," he said gently. "I'll take you back." But she shook her head. "It wouldn't ever be the same. I can remember how excited I was at Christmas, but I couldn't be again." He lifted his head and sniffed the wind. "I can smell the salt," he said. I shouldn't have brought you here, Elizabeth, to make you sad." "But it's a good full sadness, dear. It's a luxurious sadness. I can remember how the pools were in the early morning at low tide, glistening and damp, the crabs scrambling over the rocks, and the little eels under the round stones. Joseph, can't we eat lunch now?" "It isn't nearly noon yet. Are you hungry already?" "I'm always hungry at a picnic," she said, smiling. "When Mother and I went up to Huckleberry Hill, we sometimes started to eat lunch before we were out of sight of the house. I'd like to eat while I'm up here." He walked to the horses and loosened their cinches and brought back the saddlebags, and he and Elizabeth munched the thick sandwiches and stared off at the pass and at the angry ocean beyond. "The clouds seem to be moving in," she observed. "Maybe there will be rain tonight." "It's only fog, Elizabeth. It's always fog this year. The earth is turning white. Do you see? The brown is going out of it." She chewed her sandwich and gazed always at the little patch of sea. "I remember so many things," she said. "They pop up in my mind suddenly like ducks in a shooting gallery. I just thought then how the Italians go out on the rocks at low tide with big slabs of bread in their hands. They crack open the sea urchins and spread part of them on the bread. The males are sweet and the females are sour. The urchins, not the Italians, of course." She scrunched up the papers from the lunch and wadded them back into the saddlebag. "We better ride on now, dear. It won't do to stay out very long." Although there had been no movement of the clouds, the haze was thickening about the sun, and the wind grew colder. Joseph and Elizabeth walked their horses down the slope. "You still want to go to the pine grove?" he asked. "Why, of course. That's the main reason for the trip. I'm going to scotch the rock." And as she spoke, a hawk shot from the air with doubled fists. They heard the shock of flesh, and in a second the hawk flew up again, burying a screaming rabbit in its claws. Elizabeth dropped her reins and covered her ears until the sound was out of hearing. Her lip trembled. "It's all right, I know it is. I hate to see it, though." "He missed his stroke," Joseph said. "He should have broken its neck with the first blow, but he missed." They watched the hawk fly over to the pine grove and disappear among the trees. They had not far to go, down a long slope and then along a ridge until they came at last to the outpost trees. Joseph pulled up. "We'll tie the horses here and walk in," he said. When they were afoot, he hurried ahead to the little stream. "It isn't dry," he called. "It isn't down a bit." Elizabeth walked over and stood beside him. "Does that make you feel better, Joseph?" He glanced quickly at her, feeling a little mockery in her words, but he could see none in her face. "It's the first running water I've seen for a long time," he said. "It's as though the country were not dead while this stream is running. This is like a vein still pumping blood." "Silly," she said. "You come from a country where it rains often. See how the sky is darkening, Joseph? I wouldn't be surprised if it should rain." He glanced upward. "Only fog," he said. "But it will be cold soon. Come, let's go in." The glade was silent as always, and the rock was still green. Elizabeth spoke loudly to break the silence. "You see, I knew it was only my condition that made me afraid of it." "It must be a deep spring to be still running," Joseph said, "and the rock must be porous to suck up the water for the moss." Elizabeth leaned down and looked into the dark cave from which the stream flowed. "Nothing in there," she said, "just a deep hole in the rock, and the smell of wet ground." She stood up again and patted the shaggy sides of the rock. "It's lovely moss, Joseph. See how deep?" She pulled out a handful and held up the damp black roots for him to see. "I'll never dream of you any more," she said to the rock. The sky was dark gray by now, and the sun had gone. Joseph shivered and turned away. "Let's start for home, dear. The cold's coming." He strolled toward the path. Elizabeth stood beside the rock. "You think I'm silly, don't you, Joseph?" she called. "I'll climb up on its back and tame it." She dug her heel into the steep side of the mossy rock and made a step and pulled herself up, and then another. Joseph turned around. "Be careful you don't slip," he called. Her heel dug for a third step, and then the moss stripped off a little. Her hands gripped the moss and tore it out. Joseph saw her head describe a little arc and strike the ground. As he ran toward her, she turned slowly on her side. Her whole body shuddered violently for a second, and then relaxed. He stood over her for an instant before he ran to the spring and filled his hands with water. But when he came back to her, he let the water fall to the ground, for he saw the position of her neck and the gray that was stealing into her cheeks. He sat stolidly on the ground beside her and mechanically picked up her hand and opened the fingers clenched full of pine needles. He felt for the pulse and found none there. Joseph put her hand gently down, as though he feared to awaken her. He said aloud, "I don't know what it is." The icy chill was creeping inward upon him. "I should turn her over," he thought. "I should take her home." He looked at the black scars on the rock where her heels had dug a moment before. "It was too simple, too easy, too quick," he said aloud. "It was too quick." He knew that his mind could not grasp what had happened. He tried to make himself realize it. All the stories, all the incidents that made the life were stopped in a second. Opinions stopped, the ability to feel, all stopped without any meaning. He wanted to make himself know what happened, for he could feel the beginning of the calm settling upon him. He wanted to cry out once in personal pain before he was cut off and unable to feel sorrow or resentment. There was a little stinging drops of cold on his head. He looked up and saw that it was raining gently. The drops fell on Elizabeth's cheeks and flashed in her hair. The calm was settling on Joseph. He said, "Goodbye, Elizabeth." And before the words were completely out, he was cut off and aloof. He removed his coat and laid it over her head. It was the one chance to communicate, he said. Now it is gone. The pattering rain was kicking up little explosions of dust in the glade. He heard the faint whisper of the stream as it stole across the flat and disappeared into the brush. And still he sat by the body of Elizabeth, loath to move, muffled in the calm. Once he stood up and touched the rock timidly. and looked up at its flat top. In the rain, a vibration of life came into the place. Joseph lifted his head as though he were listening, and then he stroked the rock tenderly. "Now you are two, and you are here. Now I know where I must come." His face and beard were wet. The rain dripped into his open shirt. He stooped and picked up the body in his arms and supported the sagging head against his shoulder. He marched down the trail and into the open. There was a dull rainbow in the east, fastened by its ends to the hills. Joseph turned the extra horse loose to follow. He slung his burden to one shoulder while he mounted his horse, and then settled the loose bundle on the saddle in front of him. The sun broke through and flashed on the windows of the farm buildings below him. The rain had stopped now. The clouds withdrew toward the ocean again. Joseph thought of the Italians on the rocks, cracking the sea urchins to eat on their bread. And then his mind went back to a thing Elizabeth had said ages before. Homer is thought to have lived 900 years before Christ. He said it over and over. Before Christ. Before Christ. Dear earth, dear land. Rama will be sorry. She can't know. The forces gather and center and become one and strong. Even I will join the center. He shifted the bundle to rest his arms, and he knew how he loved the rock and hated it. The lids drew halfway down over his eyes with fatigue. Yes, Rama will be sorry. She will have to help me with the baby. Thomas came into the yard to meet Joseph. He started to ask a question, and then seeing how tight and gray Joseph's face was, he advanced quickly and held up his arms to take the body. Joseph dismounted wearily, caught the free horses, and tied it to the corral fence. Thomas still stood mutedly, holding the body in his arms. She slipped and fell, Joseph explained woodenly. It was only a little fall. I guess her neck is broken. He reached out to take the burden again. She tried to climb the rock and the pines. He went on. The moss skinned off. Just a little fall. You wouldn't believe it. I thought at first she had only fainted. I brought water before I saw. Be still, Thomas said sharply. Don't talk about it now. And Thomas withheld the body from him. Go away, Joseph. I'll take care of this. Take your horse and ride. Go to Nuestra Senora and get drunk. Joseph received the orders and accepted them. I'll go to walk along the river, he said. Did you find any water today? No. Thomas turned away and walked toward his own house, carrying the body of Elizabeth. For the first time that he could remember, Thomas was crying. Joseph watched him until he climbed the steps, and then he walked away at a quick pace, nearly a run. He came to the dry river and hurried up it. Over the round, smooth stones, the sun was going down in the mouth of Puerto Suelo, and the clouds that had rained a little towered in the east like red walls and threw back a red light on the land that made the leafless trees purple. Joseph hurried on up the river. There was a deep pool, he thought. It couldn't be all dry. It was too deep. For at least a mile he went up the stream bed, and at last he found the pool, deep and brown and ill-smelling. In the dusk light he could see the big black eels moving about in slow convulsions. The pool was surrounded on two sides by round, smooth boulders. In better times a little waterfall plunged into it. The third side gave on a sandy beach, cut and trampled with the tracks of animals, the dainty spearheads of deer and the pads of lions and the little hands of raccoons, and over everything the mirroring spread of wild pigs' hooves. Joseph climbed on top of one of the water-worn boulders and sat down, clasping one knee in his arms. He shivered a little with the cold, although he did not feel it, as he stared down at the pool. The whole day passed before him, not as a day, but as an epoch. He remembered little gestures he had not known he had seen. Elizabeth's words came back to him, so true in intonation, so complete in emphasis, that he thought he really heard them again. The words sounded in his ears. This is the storm, he thought. This is the beginning of the thing I knew. There is some cycle here, steady and quick and unchangeable as a flywheel. And the tired thought came to him that if he gazed into the pool and cleaned his mind of every cluttering picture, he might come to know the cycle. There came a sharp grunting from the brush. Joseph lost his thought and looked toward the beach. 5 lean wild pigs and 1 great curved-tusked boar came into the open and approached the water. They drank cautiously, and then wading noisily into the water, they began to catch the eels and to eat them, while the slimy fish slapped and struggled in their mouths. 2 pigs caught 1 eel and, squalling angrily, tore it in two, and each chewed up its portion. The night was almost down before they waded back to the beach and drank once more. Suddenly there came a flash of yellow light. One of the pigs fell under in a furious way. There was a crunch of bone and a shrill screaming, and then the ray arched its back, and the lean and sleek lion looked around and leaped back from the charging boar. The boar snorted at its dead, and then whirled and led the 4 others into the brush. Joseph stood up, and the lion watched him, lashing its tail. "If I could only shoot you," Joseph said aloud, "there would be an end and a new beginning, but I have no gun. Go on with your dinner." He climbed down from the rock and walked away through the trees. When that pool is gone, the beasts will die, he thought, or maybe they'll move over the ridge. He walked slowly back to the ranch, reluctant to go, and yet fearing a little to be out in the night. He thought how a new bond tied him to the earth, and how this land of his was closer now. A lantern shone in the shed behind the barn, and there came a sound of hammering. Joseph went to the door and saw Thomas working on the box and entered. "It hardly looks large enough," he said. Thomas did not look up. "I measured. It will be right. I saw a lion, Thomas. Saw it kill a wild pig. Sometime soon you better take some dogs and kill it. The calves will suffer else." He hurried on. "Tom, we talked when Benji died. We said it takes graves to make a place one's own. That is a true thing. That makes us a part of the place. There's some enormous truth in this." Thomas nodded over his work. "I know. Jose and Manuel will dig in the morning. I don't want to dig for our own dead." Joseph turned away, trying to leave the shed. "You are sure it's big enough?" "Sure. I measured." "And Tom, don't put a little fence around. I want it to sink and be lost as soon as it can." He went then, quickly. In the yard he heard the Warren children whispering. "There he goes," said Martha. "You aren't to say anything to him." He went to his own dark house and lighted the lamp and set the fire in the stove. The clock wound by Elizabeth still ticked, storing in its spring the pressure of her hand, and the wool socks she had hung to dry over the stove screen were still damp. These were vital parts of Elizabeth that were not dead yet. Joseph pondered slowly over it. Life cannot be cut off quickly. One cannot be dead until the things he changed are dead. His effect is the only evidence of his life. While there remains even a plaintive memory, a person cannot be cut off dead, and he thought, it's a long, slow process for a human to die. We kill a cow and it is dead as soon as the meat is eaten, but a man's life dies as a commotion in a still pool dies, in little waves, spreading and growing back towards stillness. He leaned back in his chair and turned the lamp wick down until only a little blue light came from it, and then he sat relaxed and tried to shepherd his thoughts again, but they had spread out, feeding in 100 different places, so that his attention was lost, and he thought in tones, in currents of movement, in color, and in slow plodding rhythm. He looked down at his slouched body, at his curved arms and hands resting in his lap. Size changed. A mountain range extended in a long curve, and on its end were 5 little ranges, stretching out with narrow valleys between them. If one looked carefully, there seemed to be towns in the valleys. The long curved range was clad in black sage, and the valleys ended on a flat and dark tillable earth, miles in length, which dropped off at last to an abyss. Good fields were there, and the houses and the people were so small they could only be seen a little. High up on a tremendous peak, towering over the ranges and the valleys, the brain of the world was set, and the eyes that looked down on the earth's body. The brain could not understand the life on its body. It lay inert, knowing vaguely that it could shake off the life, the towns, the little houses of the fields, with earthquake fury. But the brain was drowsed, and the mountains lay still, and the fields were peaceful on their rounded cliff that went down into the abyss, and thus it stood 1,000,000 years, unchanging and quiet, and the world brain in its peak lay close to sleep. The world brain sorrowed a little, for it knew that some time it would have to move, and then the life would be shaken and destroyed, and the long work of tillage would be gone, and the houses in the valley would crumble. The brain was sorry, but it could change nothing. It thought, I will endure even a little discomfort to preserve this order which has come to exist by accident. It will be a shame to destroy this order. But the towering earth was tired of sitting in one position. It moved suddenly, and the houses crumbled, and the mountains heaved horribly, and all the work of 1,000,000 years was lost. and size changed, and time changed. There were light footsteps on the porch. The door opened, and Rama came in, her dark eyes wide and glittering with sorrow. "You are sitting in the dark, almost, Joseph," she said. His hands rose to stroke the black of his beard. I turned down the lamp. She stepped over and turned up the wick a little. "It is hard time, Joseph. I want to see how you look at this time." "Yes," she said, "there is no change. That makes me strong again. I was afraid there might have been a break. Are you thinking about Elizabeth?" He wondered how to answer. There was an impulse in him to tell the thing as truly as he could. "Yes, somewhat," he said slowly and uncertainly. "Of Elizabeth and of all the things that die, everything seems to work with a recurring rhythm except life. There is only one birth and only one death. Nothing else is like that." Rama moved close and sat down beside him. "You loved Elizabeth." "Yes," he said, "I did." "But you didn't know her as a person. You never have known a person. You aren't aware of persons, Joseph, only people. You can't see units, Joseph, only the whole." She shrugged her shoulders and sat up straight. "You aren't even listening to me. I came over to see if you had had anything to eat." "I don't want to eat," he said. "Well, I can understand that. I have the baby, you know. Do you want me to keep it over at my house?" "I'll get someone to take care of it as soon as I can," he said. She stood up, preparing to go. "You are tired, Joseph. Go to bed and get some sleep if you can. And if you can't, at least lie down. In the morning you'll be hungry, and then you can come to breakfast." "Yes," he said absently. "In the morning I'll be hungry." "And you'll go to bed now?" He agreed, hardly knowing what she had said. "Yes, I'll go to bed." And when she went out, he obeyed her automatically. He took off his clothes and stood in front of the stove, looking down at his lean, hard stomach and legs. Rama's voice kept repeating in his head, "You must lie down and rest." He took the lamp from its hanging ring and walked into the bedroom and got into bed, leaving the light on the table. Since he had entered the house, his senses had been boxed up in his thoughts, but now, as his body stretched and relaxed, sounds of the night became available to his ears, so that he heard the murmuring of the wind and the harsh whisper of the dry leaves in the dead oak tree. And he heard the far-off moaning of a cow. Life flowed back into the land, and the movement that had been deadened by thought started up again. He considered turning off the lamp, but his reluctant body refused the task. A furtive step sounded on the porch. He heard the front door open quietly. A rustling sound came from the sitting room. Joseph lay still and listened and wondered idly who was there, but he did not call out. And then the bedroom door opened, and he turned his head to look. Rama stood naked in the doorway, and the lamplight fell upon her. Joseph saw the full breasts ending in dark, hard nipples, and the broad, round belly, and the powerful legs, and the triangle of crisp black hair. Rama's breath came panting, as though she had been running. "This is a need," she whispered hoarsely. In Joseph's throat and chest a grinding started, like hot gravel, and it moved downward. Rama blew out the light and flung herself onto the bed. Their bodies met furiously, thighs pounding and beating. Her thewed legs clenched over him. Her breath sobbed in their throats. Joseph could feel the hard nipples against his breast. Then Rama groaned harshly, and her broad hips drummed against him, and her body quivered until the pressure of her straining arms crushed the breath from his chest, and her hungry limbs drew irresistibly the agonizing seed of his body. She relaxed, breathing heavily. The strong muscles grew soft. They lay together in exhaustion. "It was a need to you," she whispered. "It was a hunger in me, but a need to you. The long, deep river of sorrow is diverted and sucked into me, and the sorrow which is only a warm, wan pleasure is drawn out in a moment. Do you think that, Joseph?" "Yes," he said. The need was there. He arose from her and turned on his back and lay beside her. She spoke sleepily. "It's in my memory now. Once in my life. Once in my life. My whole life approaching it, and after, my whole life backing away hungrily. It was not for you. It seems enough now, perhaps it is, but I'm afraid it will bear litters of desires, and each one will grow larger than its mother." She sat up and kissed his forehead, and for a moment her hair fell about his face. "Is there a candle on the table, Joseph? I'll need a little light." "Yes, on the table, and a tin candlestick, the matches, and the tray." She got up and put the flame to the candle. She looked down at herself with her fingers, explored the dark red bruises on her breasts. "I've thought of this," she said. "Often I've thought of it. And in my way, And in my thought we lay together after we had joined, and I asked you a great many questions. Always in my thought that was the way it was. As though a modesty crept upon her, she shielded the candlelight from her body with her hand. I think I've asked my questions, and you've answered them. Joseph supported himself on one elbow. Rama, what do you want of me? He demanded. She turned then to the door and opened it slowly. I want nothing now. You are complete again. I wanted to be part of you, and perhaps I am, but I don't think so. Her voice changed then. Go to sleep now, and in the morning come to breakfast. She closed the door after her. He heard the rustling of her dressing, but sleep fell so quickly upon him that he did not hear her leave the house. Now, we're just going to read one chapter right now. Oh, it always gets me. It always gets me. And his coldness, his unfeelingness. But it's beautiful the way Steinbeck foreshadowed the death with the hawk and the rabbit. They're like a foil to each other. And in some ways, I think Elizabeth knew she was riding to her death that day. I think she knew. Anyway. Ooh. What will happen next? Because there's like 5 more chapters.